The Wulver's Shadow by ForgettableSoul. The sea was silent now, as silent as it ever got, Aidan thought. Silent enough that the whispering winds and the crackling fire seemed louder than any storm that ever blew through his old house on the cliffs. He glanced at his daughter, Moira, lying curled on her thin cot by the fire, breathing softly. For a few blessed moments, her face looked peaceful. She didn't know about the shadows gathering in the woods. Not yet. Aidan took a sip from the chipped mug in his hand, the whiskey biting down his throat as the night stretched on around him. How many years had he been out here now? Years since Moira's mother went under the waves, dragged down while he'd been too far away to help. Years scraping out a living on this god-forsaken coast, where even the fish seemed to have fled for safer waters. And now, when things couldn't get any worse, the tales had started. Stories from the neighbors, mostly whispered in half-lit corners about some kind of devil lurking in the woods. They called it the Wulver. They said it left fish for the poor, though lately all it left were cold shivers and bad dreams. He'd laughed at first, but that was before he'd found fish on his windowsill, just sitting there, as if placed by some invisible hand. He knew well enough it hadn't been left by any fisherman, not this far from the village. "Da." Moira's soft voice cut into his thoughts, her eyes half open in the firelight. "Will the Wulver come tonight?" "No, lass," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He took another drink. "No devil's comin' to our door, not if I have a say." Her little face softened, trusting. She turned over, her breathing soon evening out again. Aidan forced himself to close his eyes, but the darkness seemed deeper tonight. It was as if something out there waited for him to close his eyes, something that could drag him down, just like the sea had dragged her mother. The dreams came swiftly, brutal as a storm surge. Aidan was back in the boat, his hands on the oars, pulling hard against the waves that rose higher and higher, black as pitch. He could see her, Moira's mother, just out of reach, her hair swirling in the water, her eyes wide, accusing. No matter how hard he rowed, he could never reach her. The sea swallowed her again and again, her voice lost beneath the crash of waves. Aidan jerked awake, his hand still clutching the empty mug. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the room. He glanced at Moira, still asleep, her small body curled up tight, like a pup in the nest of blankets. For a second, he let himself just look at her, her dark hair tangled over her eyes, her face untroubled. She looked like her mother, too much like her. A scraping sound at the window made him freeze. The hairs on his neck stood on end. He set the mug down slowly, his eyes flicking toward the window, where a faint shape shifted in the darkness. It was silent, but for the soft scratching, like claws on glass. Aidan's heart hammered in his chest. It was that damn Wulver again. It had to be. He rose from his chair, grabbing the old knife he kept by the hearth. It was rusted and dull, but he'd sharpened it enough times to know it'd still cut if he'd needed it to. He took a deep breath and flung open the door. The night air was cold as a slap, biting through his thin shirt. His eyes scanned the edge of the trees, where the moonlight cast long, twisted shadows over the land. Nothing moved, only the sound of the wind, low and constant, sweeping through the heather. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice rough and hoarse. Silence. Then, just at the edge of the clearing, something stepped forward. Its shape was half hidden by shadow, but he could make out the glint of eyes, bright, sharp, fixed on him. It was taller than any man. Its head hung low, its posture bent forward. It looked wrong, like something caught halfway between human and beast. He could see the faint gleam of fur, the powerful shape of its limbs, muscles rippling under the skin. The Wulver. "Get away from here," Aidan hissed, his voice trembling despite himself. "I don't need your charity." The creature tilted its head, watching him with a kind of quiet interest, as if it understood every word. And maybe it did. He'd heard the tales, after all. They said the Wulver wasn't a man, but something worse, something that remembered what it was to be human and had chosen to turn its back on it. "I said go," he shouted, stepping forward with the knife held out. The Wulver didn't move, didn't so much as flinch. Its eyes stayed on him, and he felt the weight of its gaze like a stone pressing down on his chest. Then, as if it were nothing more than a shadow, the Wulver turned and slipped back into the woods, its shape melting into the dark until he couldn't see it anymore. Aidan stood there in the freezing cold, his breath coming hard and fast. He'd chased it off, but he knew it'd be back. Whatever it wanted, it wasn't done with him yet. He slammed the door shut, locking it and pressing his back against the wood. His hand shook around the knife, and he cursed himself for it. Damn beast was getting under his skin, same as it was getting under the skin of the whole damn village. Finley Bain, the preacher, had been ranting for weeks now, claiming the Wulver was a curse on their lands, that it brought death and ruin in its wake. Aidan didn't believe in curses, but he believed in bad luck, and he'd had more than his share. He slumped back down in his chair, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him, the loss, the hunger, the endless days of scraping by. And now, as if he didn't have enough to carry, there was this beast prowling around, leaving its damned fish on his doorstep like some kind of offering. What did it want? What could it possibly want from him? The morning came gray and cold, a thin drizzle soaking through the roof, dripping onto the dirt floor. Aidan sat by the fire, his eyes dark with exhaustion, waiting for the light to grow. When Moira woke, she looked at him with that quiet, searching gaze she had, the same one her mother used to give him when he came home from a hard day on the water. "Da, are we going to see the preacher today?" she asked. He sighed, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Aye, we'll go, only so he don't come knocking himself." They walked the narrow trail down to the village as the sun broke through the clouds, a pale, cold light that did little to warm them. Aidan kept Moira close, his hand firm on her shoulder as they picked their way through the rocks. She was silent, her small face set in concentration, but he could feel her eyes darting up at him now and then, watchful. The village sat huddled by the water, a handful of stone houses clustered together against the cliffs, their windows dark and closed against the wind. Aidan could feel the stares of the villagers as they passed, the women who looked at him with something like pity, the men who eyed him with a hint of distrust. He knew what they thought of him. He'd heard the whispers, the words they muttered under their breaths when they thought he couldn't hear. Widow MacLeod's unlucky husband, the man who'd lost his wife to the sea and come back with nothing but a broken heart and a cursed daughter. Aidan felt Moira pull closer to him, her small fingers gripping his hand tighter. She felt it too, the weight of those stares, though she didn't understand why. They reached the church, a squat stone building half buried in the hillside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the smell of damp stone and stale incense filling his nose. Inside, a few villagers sat in the pews, their heads bowed. and at the front, a gaunt figure in black robes stood waiting, the preacher, Finley Bain. Bain looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was a tall man, all bones and angles, with a voice that could crack stone. His sermons were the stuff of nightmares for the children, his words soaked in fire and brimstone, painting pictures of demons and curses that seemed to come alive in the minds of the frightened villagers. "Aidan MacLeod," Bain greeted him, his voice like gravel. His gaze flicked to Moira, lingering there a moment too long. "And little Moira. Good of you to come." Aidan didn't bother with pleasantries. "I heard you've been talking about the Wulver again," he said, his voice low. "I came to tell you to keep it out of your sermons. The village has enough to worry about without you stirring up fear." Bain's mouth twisted into something like a smile, but it was cold, empty. "Fear is the only thing that keeps the darkness at bay, Aidan. This creature, this Wulver, has been seen, has it not? There are those in the village who claim it leaves offerings on their window sills, fish it drags from the depths of the sea. But I say this, the devil does not give gifts. Whatever this creature brings, it will come with a price." Aidan felt a hot surge of anger rise in his chest. "And what price is that? A few extra fish in hungry mouths. You're filling their heads with talk of curses, driving good men and women to turn on each other out of fear." Bain took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell me, Aidan, have you seen it? Has it come to your door, left its fish on your windowsill?" Aidan's jaw clenched. He didn't answer, but the silence spoke for him. Bain nodded, his eyes gleaming with something dark and triumphant. "You see, it seeks you out, as it seeks out the weak, the lost, and when it finds them, it marks them. You are playing with forces you do not understand, Aidan, forces that would see your soul dragged to the depths." Moira tugged at his sleeve, sensing his tension. Aidan looked down, meeting her wide, frightened eyes, and forced himself to smile. "Come on, lass. We're leaving." They turned and walked back up the aisle, Bain's voice echoing after them, low and ominous. "You can walk away, Aidan MacLeod, but the Wulver won't let you go. It will come again, and next time, it may take more than fish." Outside, the air felt colder, sharper, and Aidan felt a chill settle over him that had nothing to do with the wind. He lifted Moira into his arms, holding her close as they walked back up the trail, away from the village and its fearful eyes, away from Bain and his dark words. But Bain's voice lingered in his mind, coiling around his thoughts like smoke. Back at the house, he set Moira down by the fire and knelt in front of her, smoothing a strand of hair from her face. "Listen to me, Moira," he said softly. "I don't want you going near the woods. Not for anything, understand?" She nodded, her eyes serious. "I won't, Da. I promise." He pulled her into a rough hug, the smell of smoke and salt, and something achingly familiar filling his senses. She was all he had left in the world, the only part of her mother he'd been able to save. He wouldn't lose her, not to the Wulver, not to Bain, not to anything. But as the days wore on, Aidan found himself drawn to the woods, his mind restless with questions that churned like the dark waters of the sea. What did the Wulver want? Why did it keep leaving its offerings on his doorstep, as if mocking him, as if daring him to confront it? Late one night, unable to sleep, he took the knife and set out into the darkness, his footsteps soundless on the forest floor, The trees loomed tall and silent around him, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of some great beast. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, the darkness pressing in from all sides. And then, just ahead, he saw it. The Wulver stood at the edge of a clearing, its fur gleaming silver in the moonlight, its eyes fixed on him with a look that was almost curious. Aidan gripped the knife, his heart pounding in his chest, and took a step forward. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. The Wulver didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching him, as if it were waiting for him to make the first move. Aidan felt a surge of frustration and rage rise up in him, the same rage that had kept him going after Moira's mother had been taken, the same rage that had kept him alive when everything else had fallen apart. He raised the knife, his hand shaking. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice rough, raw. The Wulver tilted its head, its gaze steady and unblinking, and then slowly it lifted one clawed hand and pointed. Aidan turned to see where it was pointing, his breath catching in his throat. There, just beyond the trees, was his house, and inside, through the small flickering window, he could see Moira, her small figure moving by the firelight. The Wulver's meaning was clear as daylight. It was a warning, not a threat. Protect her. Aidan lowered the knife, his anger draining away, replaced by something colder, something sharper. He understood now. The Wulver wasn't his enemy. It wasn't here to haunt or curse him. It was here to remind him of what he still had to lose. Aidan staggered back, his heart pounding as the weight of the Wulver's silent message settled on him. It was an unspoken pact, a grim understanding that cut deeper than any curse or blessing. The creature wasn't a monster. It was a mirror, reflecting the dark truths Aidan had tried to bury, the truths he was still afraid to face. Tomo. The Wulver slipped back into the shadows, its form melting into the trees like a breath on the wind. Aidan watched it go, the knife slipping from his hand, forgotten in the damp earth. He turned back toward the house, his legs heavy as he made his way across the clearing. The night felt different now, quieter, as if some tension had eased, leaving only the cold clarity of what had to be done. Inside, Moira was still awake, her small figure huddled by the fire, her eyes wide and uncertain as he walked in. She studied his face, searching for answers to questions she was too young to ask. Aidan knelt down beside her, his hands rough as he tucked the blanket around her shoulders. "Da," she whispered, her voice barely a tremor. "Will the Wulver come back?" He swallowed, nodding. "Aye, Moira, but it's not here to hurt us, not if we don't let it." He brushed a hand over her hair, the motion as gentle as he could make it. There are things in this world that are hard to understand, things that don't fit in stories. The Wulver. It's not what Bane says it is. It's different. "Like you and me?" she asked, her small voice laced with the simple wisdom of a child. "Aye, lass," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just like you and me." She leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder, and he felt a flicker of warmth cut through the cold. He would keep her safe, no matter what it took. The Wulver had shown him the cost of failure, and he knew now he couldn't afford to lose her. Not to Bane's poison, not to the fear that gripped the village, and not to his own despair. But Bane wasn't finished with them. The preacher's words lingered like smoke, seeping into the minds of the villagers, twisting their fears into something darker, more dangerous. Within days, talk of a hunt had begun. A few of the men, hardened by hunger and desperation, spoke of finding the Wulver, of driving it out once and for all. They blamed it for the scarcity, for the famine, even for the sickness that had taken half the village children last winter. A devil, Bane called it. A devil that would stop at nothing until it had claimed every soul in the valley. Aidan kept Moira close, kept his head down, his jaw clenched tight as the whispers grew louder, as the villagers eyed him with suspicion. He was marked, they said, chosen by the beast. He'd seen it, spoken to it, let it walk away. Bane said the Wulver had claimed him, that it had cast a shadow over his house, over his daughter, and that he had let it happen. The final blow came one night when the men gathered, pitchforks and torches in hand, their eyes fixed on Aidan's house. Bane led them, his black robes billowing like a dark storm as he stood before the door. "Aidan MacLeod," he shouted, his voice booming through the night. "You've brought darkness upon this village, invited the devil to your own door. We will not stand by while you endanger us all. Bring your daughter out. She'll be safe with the Lord's blessing." Aidan felt a surge of fury rise in his chest, hot and blinding. "Stay away from her," he growled, his voice rough and unyielding. Bane's gaze was cold, merciless. "The Wulver has marked you both. We cannot risk the curse spreading further." Aidan stepped forward, his fists clenched, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew this was a battle he couldn't win. They would take her from him, with or without his consent, and when they did, he would have nothing left. He'd be a man hollowed out, a shell, as empty as the sea that had taken his wife. But just as the crowd moved closer, a howl split the night, a low guttural sound that echoed off the trees, reverberating through the clearing. The villagers froze, their faces pale, their torches flickering in the sudden wind. Out of the darkness, the Wulver emerged, its eyes glowing like embers, its body tense and ready. It stood between Aidan and the crowd, its gaze sweeping over them with a slow, deliberate intensity that made even the bravest among them flinch. Bane raised his torch, his face contorted with hatred. "You will not stand between us and the will of God, beast," he shouted, his voice cracking as he tried to muster his courage. But the Wulver didn't move. It simply stood there, a silent, implacable force, its presence a shield that no amount of rage or fear could penetrate. Slowly, it turned its gaze to Aidan, and in that look, he understood. The Wulver was here to end it, to draw a line in the dirt that none of them would dare to cross. Aidan took Moira's hand, pulling her close, his heart pounding as the crowd wavered, their courage slipping away under the weight of the Wulver's stare. One by one they began to back down, their torches flickering out as they faded into the night, leaving Bane standing alone, his face twisted with fury and something darker, fear. The Wulver's gaze held Bane's for a long, tense moment, its silent warning as clear as a scream. Finally, Bane dropped his torch, his face pale, his body trembling as he turned and slunk back into the village, his voice a whisper of curses on the wind. The Wulver watched him go, its form blending back into the shadows, its presence fading like smoke. Aidan stood there, his breath coming hard and fast, Moira clutching his hand as if she would never let go. The Wulver had left them a gift, a parting protection that would echo through the village long after it was gone. Tongue. And as the dawn broke over the cliffs, casting light over the trees, Aidan knew the Wulver would not return. It had done its part, given him the strength to keep what mattered most, Moira's life, their life, was safe. The shadow had passed. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. The end.